Okay, I'm going to go ahead and begin the webinar now. If anybody does come in late or they miss any part of it, we will be recording and posting this webinar up on our knowledge base. Just go ahead and search for Metalogix Quick Takes, and you'll be able to see the full series of ControlPoint Quick Takes as well as Quick Takes that we have for our backup, storage point, and content matrix tools as well. So we're going to go ahead and talk today about using ControlPoint effectively in a large SharePoint farm. There are a few tips and tricks that can help people in larger farms with more sites or more users or just more data use ControlPoint more effectively, report more quickly, get the data they need, and we're going to go ahead and talk about a few of those today. We also do have a larger, more detailed document about that process. It's available on our site. I'll give you a link at the end to get to that. It's about 30 pages long, tips and tricks, parameters that you can change, information that you can get on making sure that you can gather this information for your users in a large farm without wasting system resources, without taking too long, without running into errors when running the reports. So I'm going to click through here to today's agenda. Today we're going to talk about navigation in the SharePoint hierarchy, how to get the sites that you need, how to avoid taking too long expanding out the SharePoint hierarchy, identifying your sites. We're going to talk about actions and analysis, how to make sure that reports that you run complete within a timely manner, how to make sure that you're able to get those reports to the end users that need them. We're going to talk a little bit about report scopes and data sources. A lot of people ask us activity by user report, site collection, activity analysis, storage reports. Where do they come from? How do I get that information? And is it dependent on certain SharePoint service applications, the discovery process? We're going to talk about those and send you back to those resources where you'll actually be able to see a more detailed description of each report and what scope it runs from. I've included farm discovery in the list of agenda items here. We're just going to touch upon it very briefly. I don't want to necessarily go through all of the information about how to optimize your discovery for a large farm, because our last quick take session, session 4, explaining configuration options for the discovery process, was held last week by Dave Barnett, one of our support engineers, and it is available on our knowledge base. It's a great resource to take a look through and identify how you can make the discovery process complete more quickly, get the information that you need for cached reporting, and make sure that it completes consistently. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up our ControlPoint interface here. I'm going to bring it up on my remote desktop here. This is one of my SharePoint 2013 demo environments. If you're on SharePoint 2007 or 2010, or you're on a version older than 5.2, you may see it a little bit different than this. The UI might be different. You may not have access to the SharePoint summary that's listed here in the middle of the screen, but the tips and tricks that I'm going to recommend on this quick take are going to be the same in any case. So we'll start by talking about the SharePoint hierarchy. And one of the difficult things about having this quick take on large farms is that our farm really isn't that large. We use it for testing environments and customer use cases, but we don't have 15,000 site collections. We don't have 150,000 users. So I've made a couple of changes to some of the parameters that we'll talk about just to show you how the ControlPoint application works, how it builds out the hierarchy, and what changes we can make. So we'll go to my largest web application, my SharePoint portal here. You can see that it only has 13 site collections or so. A lot of your environments will have 800, 1,000, 5,000. But what I've done is I've actually changed it so that some of our parameters treat it like a larger farm. So if I expand out my SharePoint portal web application, one of the things that you'll see is my site collections have actually displayed themselves in folders rather than listed like this, like they are in my publishing portal web application. The reason for this is that ControlPoint actually builds out the hierarchy based on a parameter that we have set called navcap. And if you navigate over to our site collection, you'll actually be able to see that. Basically, to make it short, what that does is that says if I have more than this number of nodes under any node here, any site collections under a web application, a certain number of sites under a site collection, it'll actually display those in folders. When you have 13 site collections, obviously that's not a big deal, but if I had 500, the time that it would take to display each one of those and the difficulty that I'd have selecting that would make it so that I can't just access the ControlPoint application and find the site that I need quickly. So the navcap parameter by default if I navigate over to the ControlPoint configuration site and take a look at it, is set to 45. I've changed that to 10 for our test just to show you what a foldered site looks like. I don't really have any site collections or sites that have more than 45 nodes under them, so I've actually set that just for testing. But you can see that it actually applies to all levels. It applies to my site collections, it applies to my subsites of site collections, it actually applies to my lists or groups or users. Anything that I can expand out will be set up in folders so that you can access that more quickly. Now you can change this parameter by just navigating over to the navigation section of the ControlPoint settings list. This navcat parameter is set to 10, but the default is 45. You can raise that if you want. If you have 48 site collections under a site and you really want to be able to see all those, you can change that. Our recommendation really isn't going to be to raise it over 100. That's kind of the point where you start to see some issues with the scripts that we run to expand out the hierarchy, or you see issues with the speed at which it can actually expand out. We really don't recommend setting that to higher than 100 just for ease of access to ControlPoint. Now, this is all done alphabetically. You can see that this is acceler to pointfire here, and then this goes out P to R. But I know that it can be difficult, especially if you have site collection URLs that don't match your site collection names, to actually expand this information out and see it. So one of the things that we actually recommend doing is using our search functionality to actually search for your site. So if I go back to my hierarchy and I see this Exceller site, I'll type in Exceller here. I'll actually probably get more than one result. So this will actually search through the hierarchy that we have built and return only sites, site collections, groups, any nodes under that hierarchy that have that name in them. And this may take a moment as it processes through the site. You can actually improve the performance of that, and I'll show you how to in a second. But here you can see that I see my root site and my groups and lists and users under it, under that SharePoint portal. And I actually believe that the regular configuration site under the ControlPoint web application is now called ControlPoint configuration sites. That wouldn't show up in search. Now what if you have 15,000, 20,000, 25,000 site collections under a web application and they're just taking too long to expand out? We've seen that a lot where the first time you spin up your application pool in the morning, it takes some time to expand out these sites. We actually have a parameter set up called preload site cache. In my environment, it's set to false. If you have a larger environment and you're finding that the ControlPoint application is taking a long time to expand out, you may want to set that to true. That'll allow you to expand those out more quickly, and that'll allow you to hit those sites that you actually want to access more immediately. The downside to that, obviously, is that if new sites are created, site names are changed, or new subsites are created, that won't be reflected immediately in the SharePoint hierarchy. You'd have to go back and select to refresh that hierarchy, and that'll basically recache it. So we've talked a bit about the navigation. I wanted to move on to some of the specifics about reporting, actions, and analysis, and making sure that those reports and actions complete in a timely manner using the ControlPoint application. So let's say I went into a site, and I'm going to do something that's actually a pretty common use case in larger environments. I want to find out if I have any users that have been deleted or disabled in Active Directory. I want to find out all my orphan users. This is actually a really common use case for people who first get ControlPoint or first begin using ControlPoint because, Active Directory, removing a user or disabling a user doesn't necessarily take them out of SharePoint permissions. So I want to see where users have permissions. I could run this against my entire farm. Being a small farm, it would probably complete relatively quickly. I'm not going to sit around and wait for it to complete, but it's going to complete a lot more quickly than it would in a large environment. So with a report like this, or some of our larger reports like a comprehensive permissions report, we would actually recommend scoping those out over smaller scopes. Don't necessarily run this across an entire farm if you have 15, 20,000 site collections. This report, if I run it just through the SharePoint UI, or the ControlPoint UI, this is going to process for about an hour before you'll receive information that it's timed out. You'll actually get an error message that says an action or analysis took longer than expected. We can extend that timeout. There's actually a timeout here. I believe it's called server timeout. Now this is set to 1 hour. but I can tell you that if you extend that too far, your browser can actually time out or you can get locked out of the server. I mean, there are other timeouts in place. We really don't recommend just extending that out if the report isn't finishing. What I actually recommend doing is scheduling that report out. Using our schedule options here, you can distribute out to whatever emails you'd like. You can have the results of the report set to a SharePoint list or exported as a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet. And you can use this actually to set that report and send it to multiple users rather than just running it live and getting the results in our results panel here. So that's something to keep in mind. In larger farms, the two big recommendations that I could make would be don't necessarily run a report, especially a large report, at the farm level. Scope it out to a web application or a group of site collections. And when in doubt, if you think a report might take longer than an hour, don't waste your time seeing if it's going to run. Schedule it out. That way you can get an email report out of the resulting report, and you can use that. For the orphan domain user report, one of the things that people like is the fact that I can go directly from here and delete those users. That's definitely doable through the report that you get issued out here. And I know one of the things that was just asked is, can we schedule this one time as opposed to recurring? Absolutely. You have the option here to schedule a recurring report, and this can be helpful with things like activity or permissions reports where people want to get a snapshot of what that looks like at a given time. But you do not have to set this up as a recurring report. That can run one time. So having addressed those, I know people ask a lot, what reports are dependent on what information? And the most common question we get is, do I need discovery running to do this report or that report? I can tell you that there's actually only a few cases in which the discovery process is absolutely necessary to run the report. And if I go back through here, I'll select my portal. Those are actually our trend analyses and our site collection activity analysis. The site collection activity analysis pulls directly from our XCadmin database, so that's a requirement. But the trend analysis, the reason that's a requirement is that for some of the trend analysis, like site count or storage, that information is not stored historically in SharePoint, so we actually have to store that day to day during the discovery process. But with the exception of those reports, every one of our reports can be run off of live data. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the optimal way of running that report is to run it off of live data. Let's take, for instance, our site permissions report. Our site permissions report, by default, will run on that cache data that's stored by discovery. So I have this use cache data option. If I didn't have discovery running, this option would be unchecked, and I would not be able to check it. It would actually be grayed out. So if you don't have the discovery process running, you still have access to these reports, but the reports themselves actually might take a little bit longer. We have to query directly through the SharePoint API. There can be bottlenecks in place. So that's just something to keep in mind. These reports are going to take longer if you don't actively have the discovery process running day to day. Starting in 5.3, we actually don't enable the discovery process by default. We actually, if you navigate over to the ControlPoint settings list and you expand out our discovery performance category, there's a discovery enabled parameter. And by default, this is set to false. So if you're installing this onto a new environment, you may want to go back in and change that to true. In our environment, obviously it's already been set to true. If you're upgrading from an existing version, 5.2, 5.1, to the version that we have here, which is 5.3.15.05, I can check that by clicking on my About link here. Just going to wait for a second for it to load. Here's my 5.3.15.05 install. But if you're on an older version, 5.0, 5.1, and you're upgrading to this version, discovery process will still be enabled. The timer job that we set up through ControlPoint is still enabled, and you can continue processing the discovery. One of the things that we get at a large farm is that, unlike a small to medium-sized farm, you may have multiple web front-end servers, multiple application servers. Because of the way that SharePoint timer jobs process, that may actually kick off on one of the other web front-ends or application servers, that discovery process. For resource consumption, if you want to keep that to one server, you can do that. We actually have documentation on setting up a Windows scheduled task that will actually allow you to run on just one server. And we've actually had environments that are so large that customers have dedicated servers just to run the discovery process, or they put it on an application server that's underutilized. But again, by default, our timer job will run it as long as this is set to true and the timer job is enabled. We could go through all of the parameters that we have here, but like I said, our quick take session 4 covered configuring discovery options, optimizing the performance of discovery. It's definitely one that I'd pretty strongly recommend taking a look at if you don't think that discovery is processing quickly enough for you. We've added a lot to the latest couple of versions of ControlPoint to optimize the discovery process, and it's definitely worth taking a look at. So just to go through these real quick, in a large farm, recommendations that I would make overall: allow the discovery process to run for more than the default 3 days. If discovery finishes in 2 days, if it finishes in 3 days, it'll start over the next day. If I set this to 10, that doesn't mean discovery is only running once every 10 days. That just means that we're allowing discovery to run for multiple days. The other big one that we see a lot in large farms is excluding specific content from the discovery process. A lot of environments, especially environments with a lot of users that have implemented My Sites, may have 30, 40, 50,000 My Sites. I've seen environments that have tens of thousands of My Sites, and you may want to actually exclude those from the discovery process. We have a parameter set up called WAP exclude. We can enter the GUID of a web application and completely remove that from the ControlPoint discovery process. If you don't know the GUID of your web application, you could obviously get that programmatically, but you could also get that through ControlPoint by selecting Properties, and you have a list of the properties of the web application. And if I navigate down to my ID, here's my GUID for my web application. So I would just put that GUID, or GUIDs separated by a comma, into the WAP exclude parameter and exclude that web application from the discovery process. But like I said, I'm not going to go too deep. We could talk about discovery all day. Our other quick take actually is very effective in explaining that. So basically, those are the quick tips and tricks. I could talk about changes being made to all of the parameters we have listed here to support a large farm all day. But fortunately, we actually have some really effective documentation here that's available to us called, funny enough, Using ControlPoint Effectively in a Large SharePoint Farm. So I'll just move this over here. This is a document that's actually available on the Metalogix website. If I navigate over to our product downloads and resources under support, I can view my ControlPoint documentation. And among my usage and reference guides, I have Using ControlPoint Effectively in a Large SharePoint Farm. Now this covers a lot of the things that we talked about today. And you can actually see navigation, analysis and actions, finding our sites, where we talked about the search ability. It covers, in much more detail the kinds of things that we talked about today. And it's a great place to look to identify from a programmatic perspective how ControlPoint works in a large farm, how we get the information that we're reporting on, and how you can make changes to the ControlPoint parameters to better support a large farm. One of the things that we have in this document specifically that we actually give out a lot of times is an appendix that shows specifically what reports on what scopes utilize what kind of data. You can see right here, we talked about the trend analyses and the site collection activity analysis using cache data, and the majority of our reports using real-time. Now, what does real-time necessarily mean? We expand on that a little bit further, depending on your version of SharePoint, 2007, 2010, and 2013, the specific scope of time that you can report on, if it's coming from the logging database or web analytics or search service application analytics database, and the scopes that you can run reports on and get this information from. So it's a great resource to take a look through. Like I said, I could cover just about all day each individual report and how we get that information. But the best way to get this information actually would be to navigate to the Metalogix site, product downloads and resources, the documentation for ControlPoint, and take a look at the guides we have here. Obviously, all of our guides are great. I definitely take a look through them, but if you just need that information about modifying your ControlPoint installation for that large farm, go ahead and take a look right here. So going back to our agenda, we were able to cover our navigation, SharePoint hierarchy, and how to cache that information, get that information that you need more quickly, identify sites by URL or name using the search functionality. We talked about our actions and analysis, scoping reports, scheduling them out, running them on maybe smaller scopes than you would for a smaller firm to guarantee that they can complete within a timely fashion. We also talked about our data sources. I know we didn't necessarily deep dive into that because I didn't necessarily want to take a look through each individual report, but the appendix of that document using ControlPoint effectively in a large SharePoint farm is going to be your best friend to identify specifically which report has which information. And then the farm discovery, and I can't emphasize enough, take a look at this other quick take session explaining configuration options for the discovery process. Look through that, and a lot of the discovery process can be it can be something that you have to play around with a little bit to get the best settings for your environment, especially when it comes to parallel processing, delta discovery, speeding up the discovery process. But it's definitely worth looking at that because Dave actually in detail goes over the parameters available and the changes that you can make to them. And for more information, obviously we could take a look at metalobjects.com, the ControlPoint documentation. I have the actual link here. I know you can't click it like I can. I've got a shortened version of the link here, but the key is that's available directly on our site under that product downloads and resources. So that covers the information that I wanted to talk about. I know we have a few questions here that I believe John was able to answer most of them. I actually have John Singleton, our team lead here in the background, answering some questions. I know people were looking at how to get our older quick takes and how to view our quick takes. Those are actually available on our MetaLogix knowledge base. If I navigate here, it may ask you for your license key, so you may want to have that available for you. In my case, it's actually all cached, so I have that available. But here I see my quick takes. I could actually, if I just wanted to see all of the quick takes, I'll just go ahead and search for quick takes. And here are my quick takes for different products. I'm going to have some for Content Matrix, ControlPoint. If I want to just see my ControlPoint ones, I can filter those out just to look here. And here's my explaining configuration options for the discovery process. I know someone was asking where you can actually get your license key. Depending on the version of ControlPoint that you have, if you launch the ControlPoint License Manager and you click on Manage Licenses, you can see what your license key is. I'm not going to do it here just because we use a demo, basically a master key internally, and I'm sure my licensing team would not be happy if they had to completely reissue that one for us. So I know a lot of people are asking about what version of ControlPoint, how to find the version and the upgrade process. We definitely recommend being on that newest build, that 5.3.15.05 build. We will have a 5.4 coming out shortly as well. In order to download the newest version of ControlPoint, that can be found under our product downloads and resources and ControlPoint downloads. We'll have different versions for SharePoint 2013, 2010, and 2007. We do have a 5.3 build available. And I know the question always gets asked, will this have any downtime in our environment? We do retract and redeploy our global Exceller features WSP solution during the install process. That will be basically an IIS reset. Technically it isn't, but that's just kind of semantics at that point. It's recycling everything. So that actually is a downtime that you should be aware of when scheduling out or determining when to run through that upgrade. So we do have a few more minutes here. I'm just going to open it up to any more questions. You can ask questions or anything through the questions panel of the GoToWebinar on the right side of your screen. And if you have any questions or concerns, I believe I was able to answer everything that was already asked during the process, but we definitely value you guys' input. Someone's asking how long the upgrade takes. I can tell you from my experience, usually not long. Just an in-place executable upgrade. Usually schedule out an hour, but I can guarantee you, I mean, it's not going to take an hour unless something goes wrong. And I don't want anything to go wrong for you, obviously, but in my experience, me being somebody who's generally pretty knowledgeable about how the upgrade works can upgrade an environment in 10 to 15 minutes. It might take you longer, 20 minutes or so, but it's an in-place upgrade, so you can just set it to redeploy the solutions out for you. And not necessarily set it and forget it, but you can go through that process, and usually it's done within 20 to 30 minutes total. So that's not an uncommon question asked, because we do recommend that you get on the newest build just for, you know, performance increases. We've added some reports over the last couple of builds, obviously bug fixes, enhancements, and things like that. So that's available to anybody with an active support contract, and if you're on the call now, you should have an active support contract. I don't know how you would have gotten here otherwise. Someone's asking how often we come out with new builds. I would say twice a year. We have maintenance releases and things like that a little bit more commonly, but the major point releases are about twice a year. And we'll have a 5.4 release upcoming. Obviously, I can't give a specific date to that, but that's something that we're working hard on in the background, and there's some really exciting stuff coming out with that build. Okay, any other questions? Feel free to ask, guys. No question too silly, obviously. We have a few more minutes on here. The other thing too to mention is that we love feedback. You know, any ideas you have for future quick takes, feel free to message them to us. Anything you'd like to see in the product, feel free to message it to us. I can tell you that from my experience being here for a while, most of the things that we have in ControlPoint are direct result of customer requests. You know, overall we're receptive. We like to hear from you guys. Someone's asking where to get a license key for older versions. If you launch the ControlPoint the ControlPoint License Manager, and I'll actually launch it on my end. I'm not going to show you the license that we have, but just to show you what it looks like, I'll go to Manage ControlPoint. Where's my Launch License Manager? Sorry, it changed a little bit between older versions and our newer build. If I launch my License Manager, this should look similar on older versions. It won't say Metalogix, obviously, but I could click on Change or Renew the Terms of my license, and I would click on Manage Licenses, and it would show up right there. Someone was actually asking, can we give someone access to ControlPoint to view everything but not make any changes? There actually is a way to do that. You can set a security override to give people access to just view, or you could give them access to make changes. It's a little more complicated to explain than we can do in a couple minutes here, but if you'd like, if you guys have questions like that, my recommendation would actually be to contact our support team. We have a line available. It's 202-609-9100, and I can actually show you that. We put it in big letters right at the top of our site, and if you navigate to support, you can contact support. It gives you that information, and it gives you the ability to open a ticket online. I'd actually recommend doing that. We can provide you guys with documentation exactly how to do that and explain any questions you have, but it's a little more complicated than something we can cover within 5 minutes, unfortunately. But it's a great question. It's actually something that maybe we could cover in a future quick take. So I believe that covers it for us. I want to thank you guys for hopping on here. It looks like we got some great attendance on these. It's always nice to see faces, familiar faces, people we've worked with in the past on these calls, and people we're currently working with. So thank you, everybody, for joining here. We'll have this posted on our website, on our knowledge base. If you guys have any further questions or you missed anything on the quick take, missed the beginning, missed the end. And actually, someone wanted me to show again real quick how to see the license. If I go to the License Manager, depending on your build of ControlPoint, or excuse me, your Windows Server, you may have the Start menu, and you may just be able to go to Excel or ControlPoint. If you launch the License Manager, select this Changed or Renewed the Terms of your license option, and click Manage Licenses, your license should be listed here. In our case, I don't necessarily want to show that and get in trouble there, but yep, it would be directly on the machine on which ControlPoint's installed. So thank you, everybody, for hopping on here. We'll have this posted on our knowledge base, if not today, then tomorrow. And if you have any questions, any further concerns, or you see anything with ControlPoint that you want clarification on, feel free to contact our support team. and we'd be happy to move forward with you from there. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.